evening, everyone. First, a little piece of business. Sorry we're a little late this month. We've had 3 people with some serious issues with frogs in the throat here, and unfortunately they're all sitting here. Second of all, if you have any suggestions for what we should do, say, next year for recordings, because we've got this year planned out, please email us at theawayteam@montgomeryal.gov. That'll get an email to all 3 of us. We're accepting any sort of suggestions for classic literature to be read here. Perhaps there's a good old-fashioned book from an old time ago you didn't get a chance to hear since high school and you think people should be introduced to it. Give us an email. And one last point. Today we are reading The Three Musketeers, so to make it a little more, let's say, entertaining, this will be the last time you'll be hearing any of us speaking in the American accent. I am Robert Tobias. This is Mike Green. This is Wilbur. And this is Alexander Dumas's Three Musketeers, with apologies to Mr. Dumas. Starting off, chapter 1. The Three Presents of Monseigneur D'Artagnan the Elder. On the first Monday of the month of April 1625, the town of Meung had appeared to be in such a state of revolt, it was almost as if the Huguenots had made into a second La Rochelle. The men of Meung, seeing their women running towards the high street, leaving their babies crying in the doorstep, hurrying down whatever armors they had, then propping up their shaky courage with musket or pole arm, they headed for the inn of the Jolly Miller, in front of which a jostling, noisy, and curious crowd was growing minute by minute. In those times, panics were frequent, and few days passed without some city in France suffering a similar event. Nobles fought each other, the king continued to contend with the cardinal, the Spanish warred on the king. Besides these conflicts, overt and covert, there were also robbers, vagrants, wolves, rogues, Huguenots, who were at odds with just about everybody. The citizens always took up arms against the robbers, the wolves, or rogues, and often against the nobles or Huguenots, sometimes against the king, but never against the cardinal or Spain. So the citizens of Meung, hearing an uproar, and seeing neither the red and yellow flag of Spain nor the livery of Cardinal Richelieu, rushed towards the Jolly Miller. When they arrived, the cause of alarm was obvious: a young man, but his portrait can be sketched with a single stroke of the pen. Envision Don Quixote at 18 years old. Don Quixote without the armor or the helmet, in a woolen doublet, once blue, now faded to a nameless color, somewhere between the sky and the dregs of wine. His face was long and brown, with high cheekbones, a sign of cleverness. He had a strong, muscular jaw, by which one can always tell a Gascon, even that his beret, which this young man wore adorned with some sort of feather. His eyes were open, intelligent, the nose hooked but finely chiseled, too big for a youth, but not quite a grown man. One might take him for a farmer's son on a journey, if it weren't for the long sword hanging from a leather barbic, knocking against the owner's calves as he walked, and slapping the rough side of his mount as he rode. For this young man had a mount, as remarkable as it was remarked upon. It was a Bercenet pony, about 12 to 14 years old, with a yellow hide, a hairless tail, and galls on its legs. It walked with its head lower than its knees, making a head check rein unnecessary. But despite the appearance, it somehow managed to cover 8 leagues in a day. At that time, everyone was a connoisseur of horses, but unfortunately the good qualities of this horse were so hidden, so well beneath strange color and erratic gait, its sad appearance gave a poor first impression that naturally extended to its rider. This poor impression fell by young D'Artagnan, for that was the name, the Don Quixote of the Second Reconnect, all the more painfully as he was well aware that such a horse made even the best horsemen look ridiculous. He had sighed a deep sigh when accepting the gift from Monsieur D'Artagnan the Elder, but despite its appearance, he knew well that even a beast like this was worth at least 20 livres, and that the words he received when he were getting it beyond price. "My son," the Gascon gentleman had said, in that Ursine accent Henri the Fourth never nailed to quite lose. My son, this horse was born in the house of your father around 13 years ago, and here it has remained since, which ought to make you love it. Never sell it. Allow it to die peacefully in honorably old age, and if you take it on campaign, care for it as you would an old servant. At court, should you have the honor to go there, continued Monsieur d'Artagnan the elder, an honor to which your ancient nobility gives you right, uphold your name as a gentleman, a name born with dignity by your ancestors for 500 years. For your own sake, for the sake of your family and friends, endure nothing from anyone but the cardinal and the king. It's by his courage, mark me, by his courage alone, that a gentleman makes his way these days. He who hesitates for a second may let upon opportunity escape as his fortune depends on it. You are young. You ought to be brave for two reasons. First, because you are a Gascon, and second, because you are my son. Never fear trouble. Instead, seek out adventure. I've taught you how to handle a sword. You have muscle of iron and wrist of steel. Fight at every opportunity. Fight all the more because duels are forbidden, so as twice as courageous to fight. I have nothing to give you, my son, but 15 crowns, my horse, and the advice you just heard. Your mother will add a recipe she had from Bohemian for a certain balm, an ointment, the miraculous virtue of curing any wound that does not reach the heart. Make the best of all this, and live happily and long. I have one more thing to add, which is to recommend a living example for you to emulate. I speak not of myself. I've never appeared at court, and only took part in the wars of religion as a volunteer, but of Monseigneur de Treville, my former neighbor, who had the honor to be a child playmate of our king, Louis XIII, who God preserves. Sometimes their play degenerated into fights, which the king didn't always win. The blows he took only increased his esteem and friendship for Monsieur de Treville. Later, on the first adult journey to Paris, Monsieur de Treville fought 5 duels. Between the death of the late king when the current one came of age, he fought 7 more times. And from then until today, maybe 100 times more. Thus, despite all edicts, ordinances, decrees outlawing duels, he is now captain of the Musketeers. That is to say, chief of the Legion of Caesars. The king holds him in high regard, and the cardinal fears him, a man who it says fears nothing. Monsieur de Treville, moreover, earns 10,000 crowns a year, so he's a great noble, a grand, and he began just like you. Go see him with this letter, and model yourself on him, so you may do as he has done. That said, D'Artagnan the elder belted his own sword on his son, kissed him tenderly on both cheeks, and gave him his blessing. Leaving his father's chambers, the young man found his mother waiting for him with the famous recipe, given the advice he just received, oft to see so frequent use. The goodbyes on this side were longer and more tender. It's not that Monsieur d'Artagnan didn't love his son, but Monsieur d'Artagnan was a man, and would have been thought of undignified for a man to give his emotions away so well, whereas Madame d'Artagnan was a woman, and what was more, a mother. She wept a great deal, and to the credit of Monsieur d'Artagnan the younger, despite his efforts to remain firm, as befit a future musketeer, nature prevailed and the tears flowed, though he managed to conceal half of them. That same day, the young man sent on his journey to provide the 3 parental gifts, the 15 crowns, the horse, and the letter, which include the vice throne as the bargain. With endeavors, D'Artagnan was morally and physically an exact copy of the hero of Cervantes. Don Quixote took windmills for giants and flocks of sheep for armies. D'Artagnan took every smile for an insult and every look for provocation. So all the way from Tarbes to Mum, his hand was yet constantly doubled into a fist, or gripping the hilt of his sword. Yet the fist struck no jaw, and the sword was never drawn from its scabbard. It wasn't that the sight of the wretched yellow pony didn't raise smiles on faces on passer-bys. It was that a sword immediately at the length of bumping against the side of the pony, while the sword's eye glared so fiercely and proudly, caused no less problems. So the passer-by suppressed their amusement, for if amusement outweighed caution, they laughed out only one side of their mouths, like drama masks of the ancients. D'Artagnan therefore kept his dignity and pride intact until he came to the fateful town of Mons. There, as he was dismounting from his horse at the gate of the Jolly Miller, without hostilier or groomer coming for a stirrup, D'Artagnan saw a gentleman at an open window the ground floor. Handsome and lordly, though rather grim and stern, he was talking with two men who listened with obedient respect. As was his way, D'Artagnan naturally assumed that he was the subject of their conversation and listened. This time D'Artagnan was half right. It wasn't they spoke of him, but of his horse. The gentleman seemed to be listing its qualities for the audience, who flattered him by laughing at every remark. Given that half smile was enough to rile up D'Artagnan, one can imagine what this outright hilarity had to him. D'Artagnan took a closer look at this arrogant gent who mocked him. Fixing a haughty eye on a stranger, he saw a man from 40 to 45 years of age, with black, piercing eyes, a pale complexion, a prominent nose, a perfectly trimmed black moustache. He wore doublet and breeches of violet. His accents were of the same color, with no ornaments but customary sashes in the doublet that displayed the shirt beneath. These breeches and doublet, though new, showed the creases of clothing that had been packed in luggage for a long time. D'Artagnan also noted all this quickly, but carefully, doubtlessly from the instinctual feeling that this stranger was about to have his great influence on his future life. As D'Artagnan took over the man violet doublet, the gentleman made his funniest remark yet about the Berzenay pony. The two men laughed louder than ever, and the stranger himself, contrary to his custom, allowed a pale smile to cross his face. This time, beyond all doubt, D'Artagnan definitely was insulted. Convinced of this, he pulled his beret down over his eyes and advanced with one hand on the hilt of his sword and the other affixed to his hip, trying to imitate some of the court airs he had seen displayed in Gascony by traveling nobles. However, as he advanced and got more and more angry, so that instead of the lofty, dignified speech he planned to deliver as a prelude to his challenge, all he could imagine was a gross personal insult and a furious gesture. "Hey, you, monsieur," he cried. "You hiding behind that shutter. Yes, you. Tell me what you're laughing at. We'll laugh at it together." The gentleman slowly raised his eye from the mount to the master, as if he needed a moment to be certain this could really be to him. That stranger approached him with rest. Then, unable to doubt the man, he knitted his brow slightly, and after a long pause he replied to D'Artagnan, "I did not speak to you, monsieur," with all the irony and insolence as possible he could describe. "But me, I am speaking to you," the young man cried, infuriated by this mix of insolence and manners, of politeness and disdain. The stranger regarded him for a moment with a slight smile, and then withdrew from the window, strolled slowly out the door of the inn, and placed himself in front of the horse within 2 paces of D'Artagnan. His serene expression and insolent attitude redoubled the mirth of the pair remaining at the window. As he approached, D'Artagnan drew his sword a foot from its scabbard. "Decidedly, this horse is quite the buttercup, or was this distant youth," mused the stranger, addressing the men at the window. He paid no attention whatsoever to D'Artagnan, who, fed up, placed himself in front of him. This color is well known in botany, but has hereto been a rarity among horses. "There are those who would laugh at horses who wouldn't dare to laugh at the rider," cried a furious young Emile Treville. "I rarely laugh, monsieur, but as you can probably tell from my face," replied the stranger, "I nevertheless retain the privilege of laughing when I please." "And I," cried D'Artagnan, "will allow no man to laugh at when displeases me." "Indeed, monsieur?" cried the stranger, more sincere than ever. "Well, that is perfectly correct," and turned on his heels as he moved to enter the inn by the yard gate, within which D'Artagnan could see a saddled horse. But D'Artagnan was not about to allow him to escape, with whom insolence had mocked him. He drew his sword fully, and pursued the stranger, crying, "Turn, turn, monsieur jester, I'll strike you from behind." "Strike me," said the other, pivoting himself on his heel and regarding the young man with much astonishment and contempt. "Come, come, dear fellow, you must be mad." Then, as if to himself, "This is annoying. What a fine this fellow would be for his majesty, who's searching everywhere for young heroes to recruit for his musketeers." He had scarcely finished when D'Artagnan made such a furious lunge at him that, if he hadn't sprung nimbly backwards, he probably would have never joked again. The stranger, seeing this was no laughing matter any more, drew his sword, saluted his adversary, and gravely placed himself on guard. But at that moment, his two cronies, accompanied by the innkeeper, attacked D'Artagnan from behind with a club, a shovel, and tongs. Turning his face to the shower of blows, diverted D'Artagnan so completely from his attack that his adversary sheathed his sword, becoming a spectator of the fight instead of the participant. Still immutable, he said, "A plague upon these Gascons! Put him back on his orange horse and let him go." "Not before I've killed you, you coward!" cried D'Artagnan, putting his best face forward on the situation, refusing to retreat one step before the three assailants who continued to rain blows upon him. "Yet another Gasconade," said the gentleman. "Upon my honor, these Gascons are incorrigible. Continues the dance until he's insist. He'll let us know when he's had enough." But the stranger did not know what manner of man he was dealing with. D'Artagnan was never one to cry for quarter. The fight continued a few moments longer, and then D'Artagnan, exhausted, dropped his sword, which had been broken in two by the club. So the next moment a blow fell upon his forehead and knocked him to the ground, bloody and nearly senseless. This was when the citizens came rushing to the scene from all sides. The host, fearing more trouble, carried the wounded man with the help of his waiters into the kitchen, where he began to attend to him. As for the gentleman, he resumed his place at the window and regarded the crowd with a certain impatience, apparently annoyed by the refusal to go away. "So, how fares the madman?" he said, turning to address his host, who had come within to inquire if he had hurt. Your Excellency is safe and sound?" asked the innkeeper. "Yes, perfectly safe and sound, my dear host." "What has become of our young hero?" "He's better," said the host, "but he fainted dead away." "Indeed," said the gentleman. "However, before he fainted, he rallied enough to defy and challenge you." "Why, this fellow must be the devil himself," said the stranger. "Oh no, your Excellency, he's far from a devil," the host steered. "While he was unconscious, we rifled his saddlebags and found nothing but a clean shirt and 11 crowns. Nonetheless, he said his delirium that if he happened in Paris, you'd be sorry quickly. Since it happens to be, you'll be sorry later." "Is that so?" said the stranger coolly. "He must be some prince of blood in disguise." "I'm telling you this, monsieur," replied the host, "so you may be on your guard." "Did he name no one in his fury?" "He did. He slapped his pocket and said, 'We'll see what Monsieur de Treville thinks of this insult to his protege.'" "Monsieur de Treville," said the stranger, attention. "He struck his pocket while naming Monsieur de Treville." "Well, my dear host, while your young man is unconscious, I'm sure you didn't fail to take a look at that pocket. What did he have?" "A letter addressed to Monsieur de Treville, captain of the Musketeers." "Indeed? It's just as all I have is your honor to tell." The host, who wasn't very clever, missed the expression his words began to bring upon his stranger's face. The latter rose from the window-sill, knitting his brow with concern. "The devil," he murmured between his teeth. "Can Treville have sent this Gascon on me? He's very young, but a sword thrust is a sword thrust, whatever age, is a swordsman. One is less suspicious of the youth. A small obstacle would be enough to overturn a great plan." The stranger fell to a brief reverie. "See here, my host," he said at last, "is there some way you can relieve me of this frantic fellow? In all consciousness, I can't kill him, and yet," he added with a coldly menacing expression, "he annoys me." "Where is he?" "In my wife's chambers upstairs, where they are dressing his wounds." "His clothes and saddlebag are with him? He hasn't removed his doublet?" "On the contrary, everything is in the kitchen. But if he annoys you, this young man, he does. He causes the kind of commotion in your inn that decent people can't tolerate. Go upstairs, prepare my bill, and alert my lackey." "What, is monsieur leaving so soon? As you well know, I've already ordered my horse saddled." "Haven't I been obeyed?" "It is done, your Excellency, as you can see. Your horse is in front of the gate, all ready for your departure." "Good. Do as I have told, then." "Huh," said the host to himself. "Can he be afraid of this boy?" But a glare from the stranger, he cut his musing short, bowed deferentially, and left. "It wouldn't do for Milady to encounter such a clown," murmured the stranger. "She shouldn't be here in any moment." She's late already. My best course would be to ride out to meet her. If only I could find out what's in that letter addressed to Treville. He and the stranger muttered to himself, indeed, head to the kitchen. Meanwhile, the host, who had no doubt but that the presence of the young man had dragged the stranger from his inn, went back up to his wife's chambers, when he found D'Artagnan had regained his wits, telling him the police would go pretty hard on him for picking a fight with one of the grands, for, in the host's opinion, the stranger was nothing less. The innkeeper insisted D'Artagnan should get up and be on his way, despite his weakness. D'Artagnan rose, half stunned, without his doublet, with his head wrapped in linen. Impelled by the host, he headed downstairs. When he arrived in the kitchen, through the window he saw his antagonist calmly conversing at the door of a heavy carriage drawn by two large Norman horses. The persons he spoke with, whose face was framed by a carriage window, was a woman of 20 to 22 years of age. As already knew, D'Artagnan could assess her face very quickly. He saw at first glance that this woman was young and beautiful, but she had struck by somehow a very different beauty than what the southern climates when D'Artagnan lived there. She was pale and fair, with long blonde hair falling to the curls around her shoulders, large, blue, languishing eyes, rosy lips, and hands of alabaster. Her voice was quite lively when she spoke to the stranger. Then his eminence orders me to return instantly to England and inform him the Duke leaves London. And my other instructions, asked the fair traveller. They're contained in this box, which will open when you're on the other side of this channel. Very well, and you, will you do? Me, my lady, I return to Paris. Without punishing this insolent boy, asked the lady. Just as the stranger opened his mouth to reply, D'Artagnan, who heard everything, rushed out the door. This insolent boy does the punishing, he cried, and this time I trust my quality won't escape like before. Escape, replied the stranger, knitting his brow. That's right, I presume you wouldn't dare to run in front of a woman. Thanks, said Milady, seeing the gentleman put his hand to his sword. The least delay and all may be lost. You're right, says the gentleman. Be on your way and I'll be on mine. And saluting the lady with a bow, he sprang on top of his horse, while her coachman plied the whip. Two left at a gallop, departing in opposite directions. Hey, your bill, shouted the host, whose respect for the stranger was suddenly changed to profound disdain when he saw him depart without paying his tab. Pay him, rascal, cried the stranger to his lackey as he galloped away. The lackey threw 2 or 3 silver coins at the host's feet and galloped off after his master. Coward, wretch, and false gentleman, cried D'Artagnan, dancing after the lackey. But the wounded youth was still too weak for such an effort. He had scarcely gone 10 paces before his ears began to ring, a red fog clouded his vision, and he was overcome by dizziness. He fell in the middle of the street, still shouting about the coward. He is indeed a coward, echoed the innkeeper as he approached D'Artagnan, trying this little fiery to ingratiate himself with the poor boy, as the hero of the fable did with a snail as he snubbed him the night before. Yes, a coward indeed, murmured D'Artagnan. But she, how beautiful. She who? Asked the host. Milady, D'Artagnan gasped, then passed out for a second time. Ah, well, said the host. I've lost 2 customers, but this one remains, and it looks to me as if he'll be staying for several days. I'm 11 crowns to the good. 11 crowns was the exact sum remaining D'Artagnan's purse. The host reckoned on 11 days' recovery at a crown a day, but he underestimated his guest. At 5 o'clock the next morning, D'Artagnan arose, descended by himself to the kitchen, asked for, among other ingredients to which have been lost, some wine, some oil, and some rosemary. Then, with his mother's recipe at hand, he prepared a balm that he applied to his numerous wounds, replacing his bandages himself and refusing the aid of the doctor. Thanks no doubt to the effectiveness of the Bohemian balm, and perhaps also thanks to the absence of the doctor, D'Artagnan was back on his feet before the evening. By the next day, however, he was nearly cured. When it came time to pay for the rosemary, the oil, and the wine, which were his only purchases, D'Artagnan had eaten nothing at all, in contrast with the yellow horse that, according to the hoster, had eaten 3 times the usual amount. D'Artagnan found nothing in his pockets but his old velvet purse with 11 crowns. The letter addressed to Monsieur de Treville had disappeared. The young man began to search for the letter with great diligence, turning all his pockets out 20 times, rummaging through his saddlebag, examining every fold of his belt pouch. Finally, he concluded the letter was really gone, and flew into such a rage that the outcome probably would have required another purchase of wine, oil, and rosemary. When the host saw this young hothead threatening to destroy his establishment unless the letter was found, he seized upon an iron spit, his wife grabbed a broom handle, and the servants picked up the same clubs they'd used before. "My letter of recommendation," cried D'Artagnan. "My letter, or by God's blood, I'll split you all like fowls." Unfortunately, the circumstances were against the young man fulfilling his threat, as he entirely forgot that his sword had been broken in two in the first brawl. When D'Artagnan drew the rapier, he found himself armed with the stump of a sword 6 or 8 inches in length, which the host had carefully replaced in the scabbard. As for the rest of the blades, the innkeeper had slyly put it aside for use as a larding pin. However, this trick probably wouldn't have stopped the fiery young man had it not occurred to him that the host and this guest had a legitimate complaint. "Wait a minute," said, lowering the spit. "Where's this letter exactly?" "Exactly, where is that letter?" D'Artagnan cried. "In the first place, let me warn you, the letter is for Monsieur de Treville, and must be found. If it isn't found, he'll know how to see that it is found." This threat completely intimidated the host. After the king and the cardinal, Monsieur de Treville was probably the name most frequently upon the lips of both military and middlemen. True, there was also Father Joseph, but the name was never spoken aloud. With such terror he inspired the Grey Eminence, as the cardinal's familiars so called. So the host dropped his spit, ordered his wife to servants to do the same with their weapons, and set the example by beginning the search for the lost letter. "Is this letter of great value?" he asked, after some minutes of futile search. "So indeed, I should think so," cried the Gascon, who continued this letter to help him make his way to court. "It contains my fortune." "Letters of credit drawn upon public fund?" asked the host anxiously. "Letters of credit drawn on the private treasury of His Majesty," responded D'Artagnan, who counted on entering the service of the king by virtue of the letter's recommendation, and therefore thought such a response wasn't stretching the truth too far. "The devil," the host said, now truly worried. "But that's of no importance," said D'Artagnan with aplomb. "No importance, the money is nothing, the letter is everything. I'd rather have lost 1,000 pistoles in that letter." He might as easily have said 20,000, but he was restrained by a certain youthful modesty. As the host was consigning himself to the devil for his failures to find anything, a sudden light burst upon his mind. "That letter isn't lost," he cried. "What, D'Artagnan? No, it was stolen from you." "Stolen? By whom?" "By the gentleman who was here the other day. He came down to the kitchen what your doublet was. He stayed there alone for a while. I wager he's the one who stole it." "You think so?" replied D'Artagnan, unconvinced. He knew better than anyone the letter's value was purely personal, saw nothing in it to tempt anyone's greed. He knew that neither servants nor guests at the inn had anything to gain by possession. "Do you say," resumed D'Artagnan, "that you suspect the impertinent gentleman?" "I say that I'm sure of it," said the host. "When I announced that your lordship was a protege of Monsieur de Treville, and that you had a letter for the illustrious gentleman, he took very uneasy. He asked me where the letter was, and immediately went down to the kitchen, where he knew your doublet to be." Then that's my thief," replied D'Artagnan. "I'll complain to Monsieur de Treville, and Monsieur de Treville will complain to the king." He then majestically drew 2 crowns from his purse and presented them to the host, who accompanied him, hat in hand, to the gate. D'Artagnan remounted his yellow horse and rode off. The horse carried him, without further incident, to Porte Saint-Antoinette at Paris, where his owner sold him for 3 crowns, a good price considering D'Artagnan had ridden him hard on the final stage. The dealer to whom D'Artagnan sold the old nag made it clear that he'd give the young man such an exorbitant sum solely due to the uniqueness of the horse's color. Thus D'Artagnan entered Paris on foot, carrying his saddlebag under his arm, and marched along until he found a chamber to rent that matched his limited resources. This chamber was a sort of attic situated in the house of Rue des Foyers, near Luxembourg Palace. As soon as he made his down payment, D'Artagnan took possession of the room, passing the rest of the day sewing some ornamental lace onto his doublet and breeches. His mother had secretly removed the lace from a nearly new doublet belonging to D'Artagnan the elder and gave it to her son. Next, he went to Quai de la Ferrerie to have a new blade put on his sword, and went over to the Louvre to ask the king's Musketeers he should meet how to find the hotel or mansion of Monsieur de Treville. This turned out to be in the Rue de Vieux Colombier, in this same neighborhood as the room rented by D'Artagnan, a circumstance he took as a good omen for success on his journey. After this, content with the way he conducted himself among, without remorse for his past, confident in his present, and hopeful for the future, he went to bed and slept the sleep of the brave. This naive sleep carried him to 9 o'clock the next morning, when he rose to make his way to the hotel of the famous Monsieur de Treville, who was, in his father's esteem, the third person of the realm.
Chapter 2. Monsieur de Treville's Anteroom. Monsieur de Treville, as his family in Gascony was still called, or Monsieur de Treville, as he had finally come to be known in Paris, really had begun like D'Artagnan, that is, lacking money, but generously endowed. With the daring quick-wittedness and shrewd intelligence that often makes the poorest Gascon country squire receive more from his paternal inheritance in exception than the richest nobleman in Perigord or Berry receives in realty. In a time when violence was an everyday matter, his insolent courage and more insolent good luck enabled him to reach the top of the difficult ladder known as favor for the court, climbing it 4 rungs at a time. He was a friend of the king, who, as is well known, revered the memory of his father, Henry IV. Monsieur de Treville's father had served Henry IV faithfully in the wars against the Catholic League. Unable to reward him with money, which he lacked all his life, so that he was always paid his debts with the only thing he had ever borrowed, wit, the king authorized him, after the surrender of Paris, to take his coat of arms, a golden lion passant on gules, with the motto, Fidelis et Fortis. This enriched him in honor, but left him scantily supplied with worldly goods, with the result that, when he died, his only bequest to his son was his sword and his motto. Because of this double gift and unblemished name that went with it, Monsieur de Treville was admitted into the young prince's household, where he served so well with his sword, and was so faithful in his motto that Louis XIII, one of the best swordsmen in the kingdom, sometimes said that if he had a friend who was going to fight a duel, he would recommend himself as the second and Treville, or perhaps Treville even before himself. Louis XIII had genuine affection for Treville, a royal selfish affection, but still affection. In those troubled times, everyone in high position tried to surround himself with men of Treville's quality. Many other noblemen could claim the epithet of strong, which was the second part of his motto, but few could claim faithful. It's the first part. Treville was one of those few. He was one of those rare people with the obedient intelligence of a mastiff, reckless valor, alert eyes, and always ready to act. He used his eyes to see if the king was displeased with someone, and his hands to strike down that displeasing someone, who might have proved to be an assassin, like Besme, Morviers, Poltrot de Moët, or Vitry. For a time, all that prevented him from rising to great heights was lack of the right opportunity. He was constantly on the lookout for the opportunity and determined to seize it if it came within reach. Louis XIII placed him in command of King's Musketeers, who, in fanatical devotion to their sovereign, equaled Harry III's Ordinaires and Louis XI's Scottish Guards. The cardinal did not let himself be outdone by the king. When he saw the formidable elite corps which Louis XIII had surrounded himself, this secondary, or rather this primary king of France, decided that he too must have his guards. He therefore had his musketeers as Louis XIII had his own. The two rival powers searched all the French provinces, and even foreign countries, for renowned swordsmen to place in their service. During their evening chess game, Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII often argued about the merits of their respective bodyguards. Each praised the bearing and courage of his own, and while they only openly opposed duels and brawls, each secretly urged his men to fight against the others, and felt deep sorrow or boundless joy at each victory or defeat. So we are told, at least in the memoirs of a man who took part in a few of those defeats and many of those victories. Treville had appealed to his master's weak side, and it was to this shrewd approach that he owed the long and constant favor of a monarch who was not left a reputation for being very loyal in his friendships. He made his musketeers parade in front of Cardinal Richelieu with a mocking expression that made his eminence's gray mustache bristle with rage. Treville had an admirable understanding of war at the time, when if soldiers were not living at the expense of the enemy, they lived at the expense of their compatriots. His own soldiers formed a legion of turbulent daredevils who recognized no authority but his own. Unruly, hard-drinking, and scarred, the king's musketeers, or rather Treville's musketeers, invaded taverns, promenades, public games, talking loudly and curling their mustaches, rattling their swords, and joyously clashing with the cardinal's guards when they encountered them. They would then make joking remarks as they drew their swords in the street. They were sometimes killed, but in that case were sure to be mourned and avenged. They often killed, and they were sure not to languish in prison because Monsieur de Treville would have released them. They worshipped him and constantly sang his praises, and pugnacious ruffians though they were, they trembled before him like schoolboys before their master, obeying him unquestioningly, and were always ready to die in order to wipe away the slightest reproach from him. Treville had used that powerful weapon first for the king and the king's friends, then for himself and his own friends. But in none of the many memoirs that have come down to us from that time is there any mention of his ever having been accused of, or even by his enemies, of taking money from the services of his men. With a rare genius for intrigue that made him the equal of the greatest schemers, he remained an honest man. And despite the roughness and fatigue of his military exercises, he was one of the most accomplished men of his day of the arts of gallantry, elegant flirtation, and seduction. He was as famous for his success with women as Bassompierre had been 20 years earlier, which is saying a great deal. He had thus reached the peak of the human condition. He was admired, feared, and loved. Louis XIV's best radiance dimmed all the lesser luminaries at his court, but his father, a sun unable to shine on many different worlds, did not prevent his favorites from having their own splendor, or his courtiers from proving their personal worth. Besides the levies of the king and the cardinal, there were then in Paris more than 200 minor levies held in varying degrees of esteem. Treville's was one of the most eagerly sought after. Beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning in summer and 8 o'clock in winter, the courtyard of his house on the Rue du Vieux Colombier was like a camp. 50 or 60 musketeers, who seemed to work in relays so that there would always be an impressive number of them, walked about fully armed and ready for anything. The staircase was large enough for our civilization to build an entire house in the space it occupied. Up and down it was Parisians seeking some favor or other, provincial noblemen eager to be enrolled, and servants in liveries of all colors bringing messages for Monsieur de Treville from their masters. On long circular benches in the anteroom sat the elite, that is, those who had been summoned. Here there was a hum of conversation from morning until evening, while in his study next to the anteroom, Monsieur de Treville received visitors, listened to complaints, and gave orders, and like the king on his balcony, at the Louvre, he had only to go to his window to inspect his armed men. On the day when D'Artagnan presented himself, the assembly was impressive, especially to a provincial newly arrived in Paris, though it is true that this provincial was a Gascon and that, especially in those days, Gascons had a reputation of not being easily intimidated. As soon as the visitor had passed the massive gate studded with long square-headed nails, he found himself in the midst of loud, playful, and sometimes quarrelsome swordsmen, walking back and forth in the courtyard. Only an officer, a great lord, or a pretty woman could have made an easy passage through those turbulent waters. D'Artagnan's heart was pounding when he stepped into the disorderly throng. His long rapier hung beside his slender leg, and he kept a hand on the brim of his hat, with the half-smile of an embarrassed provincial who wants to put up a good front. He breathed more freely each time he passed a group, but then he realized that they were looking at him. And for the first time in his life, after having had a rather good opinion of himself until then, felt ridiculous. When he reached the staircase, it was even worse. At the foot of the stairs, 4 musketeers were playing a game, while 10 or 12 of their comrades waited for their turn on the landing. The game was as follows. One of the four stood on a step above the 3 others, sword in hand, and tried to prevent them from coming up, while they deftly fenced against him. At first, D'Artagnan thought that they were using blunt-tipped fencing foils, but then he saw one of them receive a slight wound. He realized those swords were fully sharpened. At each wound, the fencers, as well as onlookers, laughed wildly. The man at the upper step was holding off his opponents with amazing skill. A circle formed around them. The rule was that each time a man was touched, he moved down 1 place on the waiting list for an interview with Monsieur de Treville, and the man who had touched him moved up 1 place. In 5 minutes, all 3 attackers had been touched. 1 on the wrist, 1 on the chin, 1 by the ear, and by a defender above them, who remained unscathed and thus 3 places above on the waiting list. Though he tried hard not to show it, D'Artagnan was astonished by this pastime. He came from a province where hotheads were common, but he had never seen swordplay on such a trivial pretext, and the blustering bravado of those 4 men went beyond anything he had ever seen before, even in Gascony. He felt as though he had been transported into the land of giants where Gulliver was so frightened, and there was more to come. He still had to reach the landing of the anteroom. On the landing, there was no swordplay. Instead, men were telling stories about women, and in the anteroom, stories about the court. On the landing, D'Artagnan blushed. In the anteroom, he shuddered. His lively, roving imagination, which in Gascony made him dangerous to young chambermaids, and sometimes to their young mistresses, had never, even in his wildest moments, conjured up half of those amorous wonders, or a quarter of those gallant exploits, spiced with famous names and intimate details. And after his sense of morality had been shocked on the landing, his respect for the cardinal was scandalized in the anteroom. To his amazement, he heard open criticism of the policy that made Europe tremble, and of the cardinal's private life, which so many powerful noblemen had been punished for trying to delve into. This great man, revered by D'Artagnan's father, served as a laughingstock for Monsieur de Treville's Musketeers. They mocked his crooked legs and stooped shoulders, some of them saying satiric songs about Madame d'Aiguillon, his mistress, and Madame de Juliette, his niece, while others made plans against the pages and guards. To D'Artagnan, all this seemed monstrous and incredible. Now and then, however, when the king's name happened to be mentioned in the midst of this jeering at the cardinal, the mockers were silent for a moment, as if they all had been gagged. They cautiously looked in all directions and seemed afraid that their voices might have been heard through the wall of Monsieur de Treville's study. But soon an allusion brought the conversation back to his eminence. The jeering then resumed, and so did the outspoken comments on all his acts. D'Artagnan was terrified. These men, are going to be thrown into the Bastille and hanged, he thought. And the same thing will probably happen to me, because listening to them makes me their accomplice. After always telling me how much I ought to respect the cardinal, what would my father think if he knew I was with these heathens? And so, as the reader will have guessed without being told, D'Artagnan did not dare to take part in this conversation, but he strained his eyes and his ears to make sure that he missed nothing, and despite his trust of his father's recommendations, his instincts and inclinations made him consider those men's outrageous behavior with more approval than blame. Since he was a stranger in the crowd of Monsieur de Treville's courtiers, and had never been seen in the anteroom before, a servant came to ask him what he wanted. D'Artagnan humbly gave his name, stressed the fact that he was from Gascony, like Monsieur de Treville, and asked the servant to request an audience for him with his master. The servant patronizingly promised to transmit his request in due time. Now that he had recovered a little from his first surprise, D'Artagnan began examining the clothes of the faces of the man and the faces of the men around him. At the center, most animated group was a tall musketeer with a haughty face, dressed in a strange way that attracted everyone's attention. He was not wearing his uniform coat, which was not absolutely obligatory in those days of less freedom but more independence, but a slightly worn and faded blue jerkin, and over his magnificent gold-embroidered shoulder belt, glittering like water in sunlight, a crimson velvet cloak descended on graceful folds, revealing the luxurious shoulder belt from which hung a gigantic rapier. This musketeer had just come off duty. He complained of having caught a cold and coughed ostentatiously from time to time. It was because of this cold, he said, that he was wearing his cloak. While he talked loudly, conceitedly twirling his mustache, everyone, including D'Artagnan, enthusiastically admired his embroidered shoulder belt. "It's foolish, I know," he said, "but it's the fashion now, and besides, I have to do something to share of my money from my father's estate." "Come, come, Porthos," said one of his listeners, "don't try and make us believe that shoulder belt came from your father's generosity. It must have been given to you by that veiled lady I saw you with last Sunday near the Porte Saint-Honore." "No, on my honor as a gentleman, I bought it myself with my own money," replied the musketeer who had been addressed as Porthos. "Yes," said another musketeer, "just as I bought this new purse with what my mistress put in my old one." "What I said is true," protested Porthos. "I paid 12 pistoles for this belt." Admiration increased, but doubt persisted. "Isn't that right, Aramis?" said Porthos, turning to another musketeer. This musketeer formed a sharp contrast with Porthos. He was only 22 or 23, with an innocent, almost prim face, dark, gentle eyes, pink cheeks as downy as a peach in autumn, and a thin mustache that drew a perfectly straight line across his upper lip. He seemed reluctant to lower his eyes for fear his veins might swell and periodically pinched earlobes to maintain their delicate rosy tint. He usually spoke little and slowly bowed often, and laughed silently, showing his beautiful teeth, which gave evidence of the same meticulous care he devoted to the rest of his person. He nodded in reply to his friend's question. This seemed to clear away all doubts about the shoulder belt. Everyone continued to admire it, but no longer talked about it, and the conversation abruptly turned to another subject. "What do you think of the story of Chalis's equerry has told?" asked one of the musketeers, addressing his question to everyone in general. "What has he been saying?" Porthos inquired condescendingly. "He says that in Brussels he found Rochefort, the cardinal's right-hand man, disguised as a Capuchin, and that with this disguise he was able to take Monsieur de Ligues, like the fool he is." "Ah, yes, he's a real fool," said Porthos. "But are you sure the story is true?" I heard it from Aramis, replied another musketeer. Did you? You know very well that he did, Porthos, said Aramis. I told you the story myself only yesterday. It's not worth talking about. That's your opinion, retorted Porthos. Not worth talking about. You're quick to jump to conclusions. The cardinal sets a spy on a gentleman and his letters stolen by a traitor, a scoundrel, a bandit. Then, with the help of the spy and the letters, he has Chalice beheaded on the stupid pretext that he wanted to kill the king and have the queen marry the king's brother. No one had the slightest inkling of all that. You told us about it yesterday to our great satisfaction, and now, while we're still astounded at the news, you tell us that it's not worth talking about. Very well, then, let's talk about it, since that's what you want, Aramis said patiently. If I were Chalice's equerry, I'd make Rochefort wish that he had never been born, and then the Red Duke would make you wish the same. The Red Duke! Exclaimed Porthos, clapping his hands. Bravo, Aramis! That's a charming name for the cardinal. I'll make sure it becomes widely known. You can count on that. I've always said you were witty. It's a pity you couldn't follow your vocation, my friend. What a delightful priest you would have made. It's only a delay, replied Aramis. I'll be a priest someday. You know, I'm still studying theology. He'll do as he says, Porthos assures the others. Sooner or later, he'll be a priest. Sooner, replied Aramis. He's waiting for only one thing before he decides to put on the cassock and hang behind his uniform. And what is that he is waiting for? Asked another musketeer. He's waiting for the queen to give an heir to the French crown. Now let's not joke about that, gentlemen, said Porthos. Thank God the queen is still young enough to do it. They say that the Duke of Buckingham is in France now, Aramis said with a sly laugh that gave a scandalous meaning to this apparently simple remark. Aramis, my friend, you shouldn't have said that, Porthos reprimanded him. Your wit always goes too far. If Monsieur de Treville hears you, he'd have made you regret it. Are you lecturing me, Porthos? Aramis said heatedly, his eyes flashing. Be a musketeer or be a priest, but don't try to be both at the same time, replied Porthos. As Athos told you the other day, you want the best of both worlds, but let's not lose our tempers. That would be useless. And you know what I, and Athos have all agreed on. You're a frequent visitor at Madame de Guion's house and try to win her favors. You also visit Madame de Bois-Tracy, Madame de Chevreus's cousin, and you're said to stand very high in their good graces. No, don't admit your good fortune. No one's asking you for secrets. We all know your discretion. But since you have that virtue, use it with regard to Her Majesty. Anyone can say whatever he likes about the king or the cardinal, but the queen is sacred. If you talk about her, you only say good things. Porthos, you're unbearably pompous. You know I hate being lectured except by Athos. And someone with a shoulder belt like yours is in no position to be sanctimonious. I'll be a priest if it suits me, but in time I am a musketeer. As a musketeer, I say whatever I choose. And I now choose to say that I am about to lose my patience with you. Aramis, Porthos, gentlemen, cried the other musketeers. Monsieur de Treville awaits you, Monsieur d'Artagnan. An announced servant opened the door to the study. At these words, everyone fell silent. The door remained open. D'Artagnan walked across the anteroom and into Monsieur de Treville's study, thankful at having escaped the end of that strange quarrel.
Did I not say that there were some of us with a frog in the throat?
Apologies, everyone.
But we got to chapter 3, the audience. Monsieur de Treville was for the moment in a very bad humor. Nevertheless, he politely greeted the young man, who bowed all the way to the ground and smiled upon receiving his compliments in that Bernier accent which reminded him at the same time of his youth and of his birthplace, a double memory that makes a man smile at any age. But, going towards the antechamber almost at once, and making a sign to D'Artagnan with his other hand, as if asking his permission to finish with the others before beginning with him, he called out 3 times, raising his voice more each time, so that he ran to all the intermediary tones between the imperative and the irritated Athos, Porthos, Aramis! The 2 Musketeers, whose acquaintance we have already made, and who answered to the last 2 of those 3 names, immediately left the groups they were part of and advanced towards the office, the door of which closed behind them the moment they entered the threshold. Their bearing, though not entirely calm, still aroused D'Artagnan's admiration by its casualness, which was at once full of dignity and of submission. He saw these men as demigods, and their chief as an Olympian Jupiter armed with all his thunderbolts. When the 2 Musketeers came in, when the door closed behind them, when the buzzing murmur of the antechamber, to which the summons that had just been made had given fresh nourishment, started up again, when finally Monsieur de Treville, silent and frowning, had placed the entire length of his office 3 or 4 times, passing each time before Porthos and Aramis, rigid and mute as if on parade, he suddenly stopped in front of them, and looking them up and down with an irritated glance, shouted, "Do you know what the king has said to me, and that no later than yesterday evening? Do you know, gentlemen?" "No," replied the 2 Musketeers after a moment of silence. "No, monsieur, we do not know." "But I hope you will do us the honor of telling so," Aramis said, in his most polite tone and with a most graceful bow. "He told me he would henceforth recruit his Musketeers from the Cardinal's guards." "From the Cardinal's guards? And why would that be?" Porthos asked sharply. "Because he saw very well that his local advantage needed fortifying with a dose of good wine." The 2 Musketeers blushed to the very roots of their hair. D'Artagnan did not know what he had to do with him, and wished he were 100 feet underground. Yes, Monsieur de Treville continued, growing animated. "Yes, and his Majesty is right, for on my honor it's true that the Musketeers cut a sad figure at court. Yesterday, playing chess with the king, Monsieur le Cardinal told us, with an air of condolence which greatly displeased me, that the day before yesterday those damned Musketeers, those daredevils, he stressed the words with an ironic accent that displeased me still more, those true destroyers, he added, looking at me with his tiger cat's eyes, had stayed late at the tavern on the Rue Ferou, and that a patrol of his guards had been forced to arrest the troublemakers. Mon Dieu! You must know something about it. Arresting Musketeers. You 2 were in on it, don't deny it. It is recognized, and the Cardinal named you. But it's all my fault. Yes, my fault, since it's I who pick my men. Look here, Aramis. Why the devil did you ask me for the tabard when you would have done so well in a cassock? Look here, Porthos. Have you got such a handsome gold baldric only to hang a straw sword upon it? And Athos, I don't see Athos. Where is he? Monsieur, Aramis replied sadly, he's ill, very ill. Very ill, you say? And with what illness? They're afraid it might be smallpox, monsieur, answered Porthos, who wanted to add a word of his own to the conversation, which would be regrettable in that it would quite certainly spoil his looks. Smallpox. That's another glorious story you're telling me, Porthos. Sick with smallpox at his age? Not so, but wounded, no doubt, maybe killed. Oh, if only I'd known. Sang Dieu, you gentlemen Musketeers, I don't mean to have you hunting low places like that, picking quarrels in the streets and playing with swords at the crossroads. I don't want you, finally, to give the lamp to Monsieur the Cardinal's guards, who are brave men, calm, clever, who never put themselves in danger of being arrested, and besides, would not let themselves be arrested. Not them, I'm sure of it. They'd much rather die on the spot than retreat a single step. To run away, to bolt, to flee, that's fit for the king's Musketeers. Porthos and Aramis were trembling with rage. They would gladly have strangled Monsieur de Treville, if at the bottom of it all they had not felt that it was the great love he bore them which made him speak to them that way. They stamped the carpet with their feet, bit their lips until they bled, and gripped the hilts of their swords with all their might. Outside, as we have heard, the others had heard Athos, Porthos, and Aramis summoned, and had guessed by the accent of Monsieur de Treville's voice that he was in perfect wrath. 10 curious heads were placed against the tapestry and turned pale with fury, for their ears, glued to the door, did not miss a single syllable of what was said, while their lips repeated the captain's insulting words bit by bit to the whole population of the antechamber. In an instant, from office door to street door, the entire hotel was in turmoil. So the king's musketeers get arrested by Monsieur de Cardinal's guards, Monsieur de Treville went on, inwardly as furious as his soldiers, but halting at every word and plunging them one by one, so to speak, like so many thrusts of a stiletto into the breasts of his listeners. So 6 of his Eminence's guards arrest 6 of his Majesty's musketeers. Mon Dieu! I've made my choice. I'm going straight to the Louvre. I'm going to turn in my resignation as captain of the King's Musketeers and ask for a lieutenancy in the Cardinal's guards. And if he refuses me, mon Dieu, I'll become an abbé. At these words, the murmur outside became an explosion. Everywhere one heard nothing but oaths and blasphemies. The Montbleu's, the Saint-Dieus, the forty pockmarked devils crisscross in the air. D'Artagnan looked for a tapestry to hide behind and felt an immense desire to crawl under the table. Well then, Captain, said Porthos beside himself, the truth is that we were 6 against 6, but we were set upon treacherously, and before we had time to draw our swords, 2 of us had fallen dead, and Athos, grievously wounded, was hardly worth more. For you know Athos. Well, Captain, he tried to get up twice, and he fell back twice. But all the same, we didn't surrender. No! We were dragged off by force. On the way, we escaped. As for Athos, they thought he was dead, and they left him quite calmly on the battlefield, thinking he wasn't worth carrying off. That's the story. Devil take it, Captain, you can't win every battle. The great Pompey lost at Pharsalia, and King Francois I of Hotel was as good a man as any, but he lost at Pavia. And I have the honor of assuring you that I killed one of them with his own sword, said Aramis, for mine was broken at the first parry. Killed or stabbed, monsieur, whichever you please. I didn't know that, Monsieur de Treville picked up in a slightly softened tone. Monsieur de Cardinal was exaggerating, as I see. But for pity's sake, monsieur, continued Aramis, who, seeing his captain calm down, dared to venture an entry. For pity's sake, monsieur, don't say that Athos himself is wounded. He would be in despair if it came to the ears of his king. And as the wound is most grave, seeing as that after passing to the shoulder it penetrated the chest, it is to be feared. At that instant, the portiere was raised, and a noble, handsome, but dreadfully pale head appeared under the fringe. Athos! Cried the 2 musketeers. Athos! Repeated Monsieur de Treville himself. You sent for me, monsieur, Athos said to Monsieur de Treville. You sent for me, monsieur, Athos said to Monsieur de Treville in a weakened but perfectly calm voice. You sent for me, as our comrades have told me, and I hasten to respond to your orders. Well, monsieur, what would you want of me? And at those words, the musketeer, irreproachably dressed, tightly belted as was his custom, entered the office with a firm stride. Monsieur de Treville, moved to the bottom of his heart by the show of courage, rushed to him. I was just telling these gentlemen, he added, that I forbid my musketeers to risk their lives unnecessarily. For brave men are very dear to the king, and the king knows that his musketeers are the bravest men on earth. Your hand, Athos. And without waiting for the newcomer to respond to the show of affectation himself, Monsieur de Treville seized his right hand and pressed it with all his might, not noticing that Athos, for all his self-mastery, let escape a wince of pain and grew paler still, which one would have thought impossible. The door had been left ajar, such was the sensation made by the arrival of Athos, whose wound, despite the well-kept secret, was known to everyone. A hubbub of satisfaction greeted the captain's last words, and 2 or 3 heads, carried away by the enthusiasm, appeared through the openings in the tapestry. Monsieur de Treville was no doubt on the point of sharply reprimanding this infraction of the rules of etiquette, when he suddenly felt Athos's hand clench in his own, and turning his eyes to him, saw that he was about to faint. Athos, who had summoned all his forces to struggle against the pain, was finally defeated by it, and fell to the floor like a dead man. "A surgeon!" cried Monsieur de Treville. "Mine, the king's, the best! A surgeon, Dieu! Oh, my brave Athos would depart this life!" At Monsieur de Treville's cries, everyone rushed into his office, for he never thought of closing the door on anyone, each of whom coming then to the wounded man's aid. But all this concern would have been useless if the doctor sent for had not been found right in the hotel himself. He broke through the crowd, approached the still unconscious Athos, and as all this noise and movement hampered him greatly, demanded first and most urgently that the Musketeer be carried to a neighboring room. Monsieur de Treville opened the door at once and showed the way to Porthos and Aramis, who carried their comrade in their arms. Beyond this group was the surgeon, and behind the surgeon the door was closed. Then Monsieur de Treville's office, ordinarily so respected a place, momentarily became a subsidiary to the antechamber. Everyone held forth, declaimed, spoke out, cursing, swearing, sending the cardinal and his guards to all the devils. A moment later, Porthos and Aramis reappeared. The surgeon and Monsieur de Treville alone had stayed by the wounded man. Finally, Monsieur de Treville reappeared in his turn. The wounded man had regained consciousness. The surgeon declared that there was nothing in the Musketeer's condition that should worry his friends, his weakness having been caused purely and simply by loss of blood. Then Monsieur de Treville gave a sign of the hand, and they all withdrew, except for D'Artagnan, who had by no means forgotten that he had an audience, and who, with a Gascon's tenacity, had stayed where he was. When everyone had gone, and the door was closed again, Monsieur de Treville turned and found himself alone with the young man. The event that had just occurred made him lose the thread of his thoughts somewhat. He asked what the obstinate petitioner wanted of him. D'Artagnan then gave his name, and Monsieur de Treville, recalling at a single stroke all his memories both present and past, found himself informed of the situation. "Forgive me," he said with a smile. "Forgive me, my dear compatriot, but I had completely forgotten you. No help for it. A captain is nothing but the father of a family, burdened with a greater responsibility than the ordinary father of a family. Soldiers are big children, but as I insist that the orders of the king, and above all those of Monsieur de Cartel, be carried out," D'Artagnan could not conceal a smile. At that smile, Monsieur de Treville decided that he was by no means dealing with a fool, and changed the subject, coming straight to the point. "I loved your good father very much," he said. "What can I do for his son? Be quick, my time is not my own." "Monsieur," said D'Artagnan, "in leaving Tarbes and coming here, my intention was to ask you, in memory of that friendship which you have not forgotten, for the tabard of a musketeer. But after all I've seen in the last 2 hours, I realize that it would be an enormous favor, and I fear I am not at all worthy of it." "It is indeed a favor, young man," answered Monsieur de Treville, "but it may not be so far above you as you believe, or as you seem to believe. However, a decision of His Majesty has provided for this case, and I regret to inform you that no one is made a musketeer without the prior proof of several campaigns, of certain brilliant actions, or 2 years of service in some other regiment less favored than ours." D'Artagnan accepted without any reply. He felt all the more eager to put on the uniform of a musketeer, since there were such great difficulties in obtaining it. "But," Monsieur de Treville went on, fixing such a piercing gaze upon his compatriot that one would have thought he wanted to read the bottom of his heart, "but, for the sake of your father, my old companion, as I have told you, I would like to do something for you, young man. Our cadets from Bern are ordinarily not rich, and I doubt that things have changed greatly since I left the province. So you must not have much to live on from the money you brought with you." Monsieur D'Artagnan drew himself up with a proud air which meant to say that he asked no alms of anyone. "Very well, monsieur, very well," de Treville went on. "I know those airs. I came to Paris with 4 écus in my pocket, and I'd have fought with anybody who told me I was in no condition to buy the Louvre. D'Artagnan drew himself still more. Thanks to the sale of his horse, he was beginning his career with 4 écus more than Monsieur de Treville had begun his with. So, as I was saying, you must have a need to hold on to what you've got, great as that some may be. But you must also have a need to perfect yourself in the exercises proper to a gentleman. I will write a letter today to the director of the Royal Academy, and as of tomorrow he will admit you without any payment. Don't refuse this small kindness. Our best born and richest gentlemen sometimes seek it without managing to obtain it. You will learn horsemanship, fencing, and dancing. You will make good acquaintances there, and from time to time you will come back to see me and tell me where you have gotten to and if there's anything I can do for you. D'Artagnan, stranger as he was to court manners, felt a certain coolness in this reception. Alas, monsieur, he said, I see how great a loss the letter of introduction my father gave me for you is to me today. Indeed, replied Monsieur de Treville, I was surprised that you should have undertaken such a long journey without this obligatory viaticum. The only resource known was Bernay. I had it, monsieur, and thank God in fine form, cried D'Artagnan, but someone perfidiously robbed me of it. And he recounted the whole scene at Mung, depicting the unknown gentleman in the minutest detail, and all of it with a warmth, a truthfulness that charmed Monsieur de Treville. That's a strange thing, the latter said, pondering. So you mentioned my name aloud? Yes, monsieur, I undoubtedly committed that imprudence. But do what you want. A name like yours was to serve me as a shield on the way. You may judge how often I took cover behind it. Flattery was quite an acceptable thing then, and Monsieur de Treville loved incense as much as any king or governor. So he could not help smiling with visible satisfaction, but his smile soon vanished, and we returned to the venture in Mung. Tell me, he went on, did this gentleman have a slight scar on his temple? Yes, the kind left by the graze of the bullet. Was he a fine-looking man? Yes. Tall? Yes. Pale-skinned and brown-haired? Yes, that's right. How is it, monsieur, that you know this man? If I ever find him again, and I will find him, I swear to you, even in hell. He was waiting for a woman? Monsieur de Treville went on. Oh, at least he left after talking for a moment with the woman he was waiting for. You wouldn't know what the subject of their conversation was. He gave her a box, told her the box contained her instructions, and advised her not to open it until she got to London. The woman was English. He called her Milady. It's he, murmured Treville. It's he. I thought he was still in Brussels. Oh, monsieur, if you know this man, cried D'Artagnan, tell me who he is and where he is, and then I will hold you to anything else, not even your promise to take me in the Musketeers, for above all else I want to avenge myself. Don't even try it, young man, cried de Treville. On the contrary, if you see him coming down one side of the street, cross to the other. Don't hurl yourself against such a rock, he'll smash you like glass. All the same, said Monsieur D'Artagnan, if I ever find him again. Meanwhile, de Treville picked up, don't go looking for him if I have one piece of advice to give you. Treville stopped all at once, struck by a sudden suspicion. The great hatred that the young man made such a display of for this man who, unlikely as it was, had robbed him of his father's letter. Did this hatred not conceal some perfidy? Had this young man not been sent by his eminence? Had he not come to set some trap for him? Was this would-be D'Artagnan not an emissary from the cardinal whom they sought to introduce into his house, and whom they had placed close to him in order to betray his confidence and to ruin him afterwards, as had been done 1,000 times before? He looked at D'Artagnan still more fixedly the second time than he had the first. He was not much reassured by the sight of that physiognomy sparkling with sly wit and affected humility. I know very well he's a Gascon, he thought, but he can just as well be a Gascon for the cardinal as for me. Come, let's test him. My friend, he said to him slowly, I would like, as for the son of my old friend, for I take the story of that lost letter to be true, I would like, as say, in order to make up for the coolness you noticed at first in my reception, to reveal to you the secrets of our policy. The king and the cardinal are the best of friends. Their apparent disputes are meant only to deceive fools. I do not intend that a compatriot, a fine cavalier, a brave lad, made for advancement, should be the dupe of all this trumpery and run his head into the wall like a ninny in the wake of so many others who have perished from it. Understand well that I am devoted to these two all-powerful masters, and that my serious efforts will never have any other end than service to the king and to Monsieur le Cardinal, one of the most illustrious geniuses France has ever produced. Now, young man, rule yourself by that, and if you have, either from your family or through relations, or even by instinct, any of those hostile feelings against the cardinal such as we see break out amongst these gentlemen, say goodbye to me and let us part. I would help you in 1,000 circumstances, but without attaching you to my person. I hope that my frankness, in any case, will make you my friend, for up to the present you are the only young man who I am speaking to as I am speaking to you now. Treville said to himself, if the cardinal has sent me this young fox, it will certainly not have failed, he who knows how much I loathe him, to tell his spy that the best way to pay court to me is to tell me the worst muck about him. So despite my protestations, the cunning accomplice is quite certainly going to answer me that he holds his eminence in horror. But it turned out quite differently than Treville expected. Monsieur d'Artagnan replied with the greatest simplicity, Monsieur, I have come to Paris with exactly the same intentions. My father instructed me to bear with nothing except from the king, Monsieur le Cardinal, and you, whom he held to be the 3 foremost men in France. D'Artagnan added Monsieur de Treville to the others, as we can see, but he thought the addition would not hurt anything. I have thus the greatest veneration for Monsieur de Cardinal, he went on, and the most profound respect for his acts. So much the better for me, monsieur, if you speak to me as you say, with frankness. For then you do me the honor of valuing the similarity of taste. But if you have felt some mistrust, quite natural in any case, I will feel that I am erring by telling the truth. That is too bad, but you will esteem me nonetheless, and I care more about that than anything else in the world. Monsieur de Treville was utterly astonished. So much penetration, so much frankness finally aroused his admiration, but did not entirely remove his doubts. The more superior this young man was to other young people, the more he was to be feared if he was mistaken. Nevertheless, he shook D'Artagnan's hand and said to him, You're an honest lad, but at the moment I can do no more than what I offered to you earlier. My hotel will always be open to you. Later on, being able to ask for me at any hour, and therefore to seize every opportunity, you will probably attain what you wish to obtain. That is to say, monsieur, replied D'Artagnan, that you are waiting until I make myself worthy. Well, don't worry, he added with Gascon familiarity. You won't have to wait long. And he began bowing his way out, as if the rest was henceforth up to him. But wait a moment, Monsieur de Treville said, stopping him. I promised you a letter to the director of the academy. Are you too proud to accept it, my young gentleman? No, monsieur, said D'Artagnan, and I give you my word that what happened to the other will not happen to this one. I will keep it so well that it will arrive at its destination, I swear to you, and woe to him who tries to take it from me. Monsieur de Treville smiled at this fanfaronade, and leaving his young compatriot in the embrasure of the window which they found themselves, and where they had talked together, he sat down at the table and began writing the promised letter of instruction. During this time, D'Artagnan, who had nothing better to do, started beating out their march on the window panes, watching the Musketeers who went out one after another, and following them until they disappeared around the corner. Monsieur de Treville, after writing the letter, sealed it, and, getting up, went over to the young man to give it to him. But at the very moment when D'Artagnan held out his hand to receive it, Monsieur de Treville was quite astonished to see him give a start, flush with anger, and go rushing out of the office, shouting, Ah, thank you, he will not escape me this time. But who is it? Monsieur de Treville asked. He, my thief, Monsieur d'Artagnan. Ah, the traitor! And he disappeared. Mad devil, murmured Monsieur de Treville. Unless, he added, it's a skillful means of slipping away, seeing that his attempt
Well, Madame and Monsieur, unfortunately, that is our time for today. What a cliffhanger, I know. Well, luckily for you, there are over 20 copies of this book in various translations amongst all 10 libraries, as well as available on Hoopla and Cloud Library. Please, feel free to read it, feel free to listen to it, and enjoy. And we'd be glad to hear any recommendations you have for the next year.
All for one and one for all.
All for one and one for all.